In a small town on an ordinary evening, an unsettling encounter unfolded that no one in the community would ever forget. A black veteran, a man who had served his country with honor, found himself face to face with a police officer who seemed to judge him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. The situation escalated quickly, with the officer pointing a gun at the veteran over what appeared to be a minor misunderstanding. But what happened next stunned everyone. Witnesses held their breath, watching the scene unfold, unsure of how it would end. It was an incident that challenged perceptions, sparked conversations about justice, and left an entire theater of onlookers questioning everything they thought they knew. The truth behind this moment revealed something no one saw coming, and it's a story you won't want to miss. The veteran James was on his way home after visiting a local community center where he volunteered to help struggling youth. Known in the neighborhood as a quiet, humble man, he wore his military jacket that night, a symbol of his years of service. But to the officer, it seemed that none of that mattered. A routine traffic stop had spiraled into a tense standoff. James kept his hands visible, his voice calm, yet the officer's hand remained on his weapon, his commands sharp and unyielding. People nearby began to gather, whispering among themselves, unsure of what had triggered such a volatile response. The air was thick with unease. Why was the officer so aggressive? Why did James, a man who had faced battlefields abroad, have to endure such hostility at home? As the seconds ticked by, every heart in the crowd raced, waiting to see what would happen next. As the crowd grew larger, so did the tension. Among the onlookers was Sarah, a young mother who had seen James at the community center mentoring her teenage son. She couldn't reconcile the image of the kind, patient man she knew with the one now forced to stand frozen under the officer's glare. Her instinct was to intervene, but fear held her back. What if she made things worse? Meanwhile, the officer's partner arrived, his expression tense as he assessed the scene. Unlike the first officer, he seemed hesitant, glancing between James and the growing crowd. He asked a quiet question, but his colleague cut him off, his focus unwavering on James. The atmosphere became charged with questions no one dared to voice. Was this about power, bias, or something deeper? James's calm demeanor didn't falter, but behind his steady eyes, he carried a weight that no one could yet understand. The tension reached a breaking point as more people gathered, their murmurs growing louder. Someone quietly started recording, capturing every second of the confrontation. James's voice broke the uneasy silence, calm but firm. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. Please, let me show you my ID." His words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the officer's trembling grip on his weapon. The officer's partner stepped closer, his face lined with doubt. "Let him speak," he said softly, but his words went unanswered. The crowd began calling out, urging the officer to lower his weapon. The noise swirled like a storm, feeding the growing tension. Then, from the back of the crowd, an older man stepped forward. He held a picture frame tightly, his hands shaking. "I know this man," he shouted. "He saved my life." The crowd went silent, their eyes darting between James, the officer, and the man holding the frame. The man with the frame stepped closer, his voice trembling but determined. "This man pulled me out of a burning truck during a war zone. He didn't see my uniform, my rank, just a life worth saving." He held up the frame, revealing a photo of a much younger James standing beside him, both wearing fatigues, their faces wary but proud. The crowd gasped, and even the officer's partner hesitated, his brow furrowing as he processed the revelation. But the first officer didn't waver. His grip on the weapon tightened, his voice rising over the murmurs. "Step back," he barked, his eyes darting from James to the crowd, now openly questioning his actions. Then came the second twist. James's voice broke through the chaos. "Officer," he said, his tone low and steady, "you're holding that gun like someone who's afraid. What are you really afraid of?" The question hung in the air, turning every eye toward the officer, whose face betrayed a flicker of something: fear, guilt, or perhaps doubt. For a moment, the officer froze, James's words cutting through his rigid stance. The crowd, now completely silent, watched as the officer's facade began to crack. His partner took a step forward, his voice firm but calm. "Lower the weapon," he urged, glancing at James, then back at his colleague. "This isn't right." The officer's breathing quickened, his hand visibly shaking. Then, as if the weight of the situation finally broke through, he lowered the gun, his shoulders slumping. The crowd exhaled collectively, relief washing over them. But before anyone could speak, James surprised everyone again. He stepped closer to the officer, not with anger, but with compassion. "I don't know what led you here tonight," James said quietly, "but fear doesn't have to define you." His words, spoken with an unexpected kindness, seemed to reach the officer, whose face now showed not just guilt but deep remorse. Then came the twist. The older man with the picture stepped forward, his voice steady now. "Officer, you should know. James saved your father too. That's him in this picture." The officer's eyes widened, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief. As he looked at James, the reality of the moment struck him hard, leaving the entire crowd stunned by the undeniable power of the truth. The officer stared at the photo, his hands trembling as he pieced everything together. The man in the image, the soldier who had saved his father's life, was standing before him. The same man he had just threatened with a gun. The weight of his actions crushed him, and he lowered his head, overwhelmed with shame. James stepped back, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Sometimes we all need to pause and look past our assumptions," he said, his voice steady yet filled with meaning. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring about the extraordinary encounter they had witnessed. The officer's partner quietly placed a hand on his shoulder, leading him away as the older man and James exchanged a nod of understanding. The street returned to its quiet state, but the impact of the moment lingered in the air. It was a reminder of the power of courage, compassion, and truth to bridge even the deepest divides.